I'm David Chambers, Deputy Director for Implementation Science in the Division of Cancer Control and Population Sciences at the NCI. Welcome to a brief introduction to Dissemination and Implementation Research, the first module as part of our TIDIRC series of videos. So let's jump in. What you see here is the session outline. We'll talk a little bit about why is dissemination and implementation research so important, focus on how we define our terms and concepts, some of the ways in which we've been supporting the work going forward, and then finish up with some helpful resources and give a bit of a sense of what's to come with the remaining TIDIRC modules. Just to begin with, when we think about the completion of our original research, traditionally it's the publication that sets the tone and that we assume is going to enable us to ultimately get those findings implemented in various community and clinical settings. But what you see here, which can be summarized as the publication pathway, is what happens throughout that process. How long does it take? And what's the potential ways in which we lose those valuable findings as we complete our original research? Think about developing those publications, submit them for publication, whether they're contained in those databases and whether they form the basis for our systematic reviews, our guidelines, our textbooks, and ultimately make their way into clinical and community practice. On the left side, you see the various ways in which we lose that valuable evidence. We might have negative results from a study and it's pretty hard to publish, or we may publish, but because of the place that we've published our findings, or potentially because of the size of our study, there's decisions made not to include it in different databases, not to include it as we compile the evidence into our reviews, into our guidelines and our textbooks. While there's also expert opinion that plays a strong role, the bottom line is that if we don't do a better job of tracing through what happens to our findings, we're not going to get very far. And the tagline that you may have heard already is that from this study, which was done in 2000, so 20 years old, there's this overall sense that it takes far too long, estimated 17 years, to turn far too little, estimated 14% of original research to the benefit of patient care. And while we've made some progress since 2000 on some of these issues, the reality is that whatever our research is, if we're not looking beyond the publication, we're not going to get very far if what we're ultimately trying to do is impact health and healthcare. We recognize that the whole process of how research, how practice, how care, how policy comes together is incredibly complicated, goes through multiple stages, and we need to be thinking about what happens at different levels of our system. So you'll see in the top left side of the screen, roughly the pathway for which we develop a new idea for an innovation through discovery research. And if it's a clinical intervention, we can also see this in behavioral interventions. There's a series of phases through which we test whether that intervention seems to be working. But often left out from that top left corner is what happens next. What happens after we've thought about the efficacy and the safety of our interventions? We go down to the bottom left corner, and what we see is all of the innovations that we need to develop exist across a larger continuum of research, thinking about the basic cell biology on through how we do a better job of identifying strategies for prevention, for detection and diagnosis, through treatment and through public health. It is incumbent on us as we think about dissemination and implementation research that we're attending to this entire continuum and all of the different products that we want to impact cancer care, that we want to impact health overall. And then as we think about our care systems, our clinical and community settings in which care is delivered, we recognize that that again is multi-level. And we need to be thinking about decisions and how do we inform those decisions made for an individual patient or a person within the context of a family, a provider, team, organization, on through to larger contexts. And so again, our challenge is in making sure we have the evidence base that goes beyond just these individual interventions or these individual findings and bring us to the ability to try and optimize care, optimize health, and optimize the way in which we're translating evidence into practice. I'm reminded of a quote from an esteemed Lord Harry Henry, that we included in an edited volume around advancing the science of implementation across the cancer continuum, which goes something like this. As I approached the field carefully laid out according to the specifications of the International Sporting Society, I noted the pristine markings, the carefully attended hills, the manicured zones of grandeur. It was assumed that the mass populace would flock to such a scene, but nary a soul had visited this magical wonderland before me. It was clearly not just the construction, but the demand for its utilization that would ultimately determine its societal impact. I'm reminded of that because, again, it says that it's not enough for us to create these beautiful fields, create these beautiful interventions. We need to ask the hard question, which was paraphrased from Field of Dreams, a movie in 1989, where the voice was heard, if you build it, they will come. Reality is, from this empty baseball diamond, from so many of our innovations, that if we build them, they may not come. And we can't assume that just because we're confident that our innovations are of value, that they're going to reach those who could most benefit from it. And importantly, we don't always have that fit between the innovation as it's created and what people are looking for, as you can see from this particular Bitmoji version of me. So we've made a lot of progress over the years in recognizing that it's not just the efficacy of our tools, of our interventions, of our innovation, but that it also is important to understand how well those interventions perform within more typical, what we sometimes refer to as real-world settings. So we've moved from efficacy to effectiveness of our interventions, but as we think about the overall impact that we want to try and reach, there are other dimensions that are really important. This comes from Russ Glasgow and colleagues' RE-AIM framework, which is an evaluation framework that was looking at how do we optimize the benefit of our different interventions. So you see, it's not just effectiveness, it's reach, how well we're reaching the targeted population. It's not just those two, but it's also adoption, how we're supporting decisions to be able to deliver an intervention. It's implementation. How do we make sure that our interventions are delivered properly? And it's maintenance, making sure that those interventions can be used over a much longer term. All of this is getting at the ultimate purpose of dissemination and implementation research, which is really about asking, so what? So what that we have this wonderful study result? But really, how do we make that research matter? Everything, hopefully, that has brought you to this course will reinforce that if we can answer that so what, if we can make our research studies matter, if we can see the health and the healthcare benefit, we're going to make sure that all of us are better off. So at this point, I do want to reflect on the key terms that we'll use throughout this course. Implementation science relating to the journal, the preeminent journal in the area, relating to the name of our team here at the NCI, is this broader definition, the study of methods to promote the integration of research findings and evidence into healthcare policy and practice. Just to note that for those of us at the NCI, we have a pretty broad definition by which we think about what healthcare policy and practice is. It's all of those community and clinical settings where people are trying to optimize the health and the healthcare that they're able to receive. At the NIH level, and certainly as the title of this course, we talk about D&I research, dissemination and implementation research. And that's because historically, we in the scientific community haven't done as good a job of figuring out the right ways to distribute our information, our intervention materials to the range of different audiences that we're trying to reach, nor have we done a great job of thinking about how best to adopt and integrate our evidence-based interventions into clinical and community settings in order to improve patient outcomes and benefit population health. These are the challenges that we need to build a knowledge base to try and address. And we also recognize that over the years, there's been a lot of different ways in which people have defined these terms. We don't necessarily say that you have to take on our definitions, but rather, here's where we're coming from. And so when we talk about D&I research, or we talk about implementation science, this is the meaning behind those terms for us. Of course, we recognize that there's a bigger tent of terms and circles. And as you see from this particular graphic, which Sandy Mitchell and I published in an article a few years ago, there's often a lot of different terms that, as we see it, have some interaction, have some overlap between. So we talk about implementation science in red as the broader way in which we think about this field, with dissemination and implementation research within them. We also note that there's been a lot of good work in thinking about how do we identify the scientific agenda out of improving care. And so we have QI, you'll see in sort of orange, and then we have quality improvement science. For us, the science that is generated from quality improvement is sort of a subset of implementation research. We also note that within the NCI, we have a branch and a whole agenda related to health communication research, which we see as one component of a broader effort to try and disseminate a whole range of different information to people. We note that as we see it, implementation science fits within the broader field of health services research, which of course is seeking to inform and resides within the larger health and community services. Last thing I'll say is that you'll notice that QI resides outside of this health services research space, but in the health and community services space. And that's because if we just think about a QI project that is trying to solve a local problem, but is not trying to generate generalizable information, then we wouldn't necessarily see that as primarily a research endeavor. But again, you see that linkage between QI and the quality improvement science that has emerged in recent years to create some of that generalized information. I want to quickly just say that with dissemination and implementation research, we have a particular orientation that might be helpful as you're trying to make sense of these different terms. For dissemination research, we really see the whole process of dissemination as needing study, and particularly as our communication pathways are changing so rapidly, and certainly month to month, the way in which we try and communicate evidence and information changes, that it's important that we think about how the evidence is created and what's gone into that, how it's packaged, transmitted, received, and ultimately turned into action. What do we assume about each of these steps, and how do we know that dissemination is successful? I'll note that this has been an underrepresented part of our portfolio at the NIH, and so we'd love to see your ideas about how do we advance our understanding of dissemination of evidence-based interventions as well. Quickly, when we think about implementation, we're trying to draw a contrast between what we often see in our typical clinical trial, which really is about the left side and the right side of this particular graphic. We're thinking about what do we deliver to a particular person that, if you jump over to the right side, is concentrating on maximizing or improving a particular health outcome. But I'll note that while that is the usual trial that we see, it jumps over a really important question, and that's the question of how. How do we get that intervention to be delivered so that people who might benefit from it can actually receive it? And importantly, it jumps over the outcomes as to whether those implementation efforts were successful. You see some of these key outcomes as things that we need to answer if we're truly going to take advantage of all of these wonderful innovations, interventions, tools, etc., that we ideally want to see improve health. And so again, when we think about studying implementation, we're not focusing exclusively on how, but we're shifting over, and this is really the core of implementation research, to that question of how. What are those strategies that will enable us to have higher rates through which those interventions are delivered, they're acceptable and feasibly delivered, what level of uptake, the kinds of costs that go with trying to get those interventions delivered. And the argument is that if we do a good job with implementation, we see a knock-on benefit for our service systems, and ultimately not one by one, but at population levels, we see improvements in those health outcomes that you see all the way to the right. So while the core of implementation research is helping us to understand what's the evidence base for the how question, we're not satisfied until we see that knock-on benefit that our service systems, whether community or clinical, do a better job at delivering care, and that in turn, our population sees great improvements in health. These are our current funding announcements, the ongoing ways in which we, not just within the NCI, but across the NIH, try and organize the dissemination and implementation agenda, the research agenda that we have. You'll see NCI leads, but we have 21 different institute centers and offices that are involved. The grants that can be funded through this are the R01, the larger grants, the R21, the exploratory developmental, and the small grant, the R03s. We funded over 200 grants through this, and we've had for the last 10 years a standing review committee that has specifically provided that expert peer review to make sure that people who understand dissemination and implementation studies are the ones who are determining how scientifically meritorious they are. We'll note that it's open to investigators as well as projects worldwide, and the contacts on the announcement are happy to review the concept papers, specific aims, answer questions. Just to give you a very brief sense, these are some of the areas that we'd love to see more in, more on sustainability, more on how evidence-based practices adapt or evolve over time, more on how do we implement a whole set of different interventions. As I said before, dissemination is one of the less explored areas of our portfolio. We'd love to see more on that, more on scale up, increasingly more on how we de-implement things that are not necessarily effective. And importantly, if you're wanting to advance research methods, we would love to have your insights as to how do we better map the complexity, the multi-level nature of where we started earlier in this talk. If you're interested in learning from those who have been successful in getting funding, I'll call your attention to two different resources. The one on the left, we at the NCI Implementation Science team maintain. These are a series of different grants where the principal investigator has offered the opportunity for anyone to take a look at that grant, how they wrote the study, and what can be learned from it. And then on the right side, you see from the Clinical Translational Science Award at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, they have an additional sample grant repository that people have been able to learn from. So we'd encourage you, if you're curious, what does a successful D&I grant application look like? I'll also note that for us at the NCI, it's been very exciting in recent years because implementation science has been front and center in one of the large efforts that the NCI has been engaged in to try and advance cancer research overall. Implementation science was one of 7 working groups that a blue ribbon panel, in the aftermath of the announcement of the cancer moonshot, was impaneled to think about. And they were asked, external to the NCI, to tell us at the National Cancer Institute, what are the things that we should be concentrating on? The Implementation Science Working Group told us that there were 2 major things that we should focus on. How do we do a better job of implementing interventions to reduce side effects and improve symptom monitoring? And how do we expand the use of our evidence-based cancer prevention and early detection strategies? This gave us the license to have a whole set of initiatives, which you can find on our website, around symptom management. There was a specific focus on prevention and early detection of hereditary cancers. And then you see, again, more on that expansion of the use of evidence-based cancer prevention and early detection. That then gave us the license to begin a whole set of initiatives that we're very excited about in these different areas. So you see 5 different initiatives under this broader heading of symptom management, 2 RFAs that we've had related to hereditary cancers, if you're interested in those, and then 5 and more occurring as well that have really been focusing on implementing better the evidence base that we have for cancer control. With the centers, you'll see in the center of that blue oval, representing an effort to try and lift sort of larger boats for the field. And so that's kind of a cross-cutting initiative that we're happy to connect folks to. We recognize that not everybody in your current state is sort of in this purple circle. You're already thinking about dissemination implementation studies. It may be that you're earlier in this intervention development pathway, and this comes from our National Center of Complementary and Integrative Health, a framework for how we think about the development of different interventions. You may be developing a new intervention. You may be doing an efficacy or an effectiveness trial. You may be even earlier than that and thinking about the foundational research that would ultimately lead us to figure out ways to improve health. But we would ask you to think more about dissemination and implementation earlier and earlier in the process. Can we earlier in the enterprise think about who's ultimately going to deliver our interventions? What's the fit with our ultimate patient population that we're trying to reach? How might we be able to build in more tests along the way of how we train people, support them, the mediators and moderators that are affecting high quality delivery? And notably, we have some research designs that have been advanced in recent years that can help us confront multiple questions at the same time.
So the hybrid effectiveness implementation research designs,
which comes out originally a wonderful paper that Jeff Curran and others within the VA wrote in Medical Care, a similar paper that was written a little bit later that year in Implementation Science, from which this graph comes. But they basically said we shouldn't have to think about efficacy and close the book on that, then think about effectiveness, close the book on that, and then start to think about implementation research. We should take advantage of different ways in which we can do those things simultaneously. Hybrids type 1, 2, and 3 are really different ways in which we prioritize and we try and answer questions about the effectiveness of an intervention with how well it can be implemented. So the type 1 is more of an effectiveness trial where we're taking an early advantage to start to ask questions about implementation. Hybrid type 2 is more of an equal focus. Hybrid type 3, maybe the principal question that we're asking is about that how we get those strategies implemented, but that we still see the value of extending our evidence on effectiveness because maybe our intervention is being exposed to people in a slightly different way, or maybe it's a new population that we would benefit greatly from understanding, is it still effective? So again, it just says we don't have to go either or. We can think about the yes and. How do we think about effectiveness simultaneously with implementation? So I'm just going to close out by saying that most of what I've said is available on our wonderful website. There's also a lot of resources that you will find on this page, or links to these on a page. So we've had on the left, Implementation Science at a Glance, a wonderful way to try and distill key concepts of implementation science for practitioners. You'll see right up front the 13th annual, which we're happy that we've now had a legacy of these wonderful conferences, not just specific in cancer, but across health, and thinking about how do we advance the science. We have ongoing webinars, typically monthly, sometimes even more frequent than that, where we encourage you to listen in to leaders in the field as we talk about emerging challenges, priority areas to come. You'll see at the bottom, there will be more emphasis in later TIDIRC modules around the models, theories, and frameworks, but a wonderful website that helps us navigate through those. And then if you're interested, and you'll see another module on that, we had a white paper a few years ago that focused on qualitative methods in implementation science. These are two books, edited volumes, one that focused more on general topics, dissemination, implementation, research, and health on the left from our colleagues at WashU, and the one that I mentioned, a quote from the foreword of that, an edited volume focusing on the science of implementation across the cancer continuum. So if those are helpful, that will be great. And I know that pieces of those will be used in the work going forward. So finally, just want to call your attention. These are the modules that are upcoming that we hope that you enjoy, and we hope that you learn from. All refreshed. One on focusing on fidelity and adaptation and some of those trade-offs in research. Theories, models, and frameworks, as I mentioned. The how, the implementation strategies. More with measures and study design, the qualitative emphasis of how that can contribute.
And several new talks on emerging areas, including how D&I research can enhance health equity, with a specific focus on technology, how we can advance understanding of policy implementation, and how we can utilize health economics to address D&I efforts. So with that, I just want to say thank you, appreciate your time on this, and I look forward to engaging with you all as we move along this journey together. Thanks so much.